Hi Marina, meet Dave,
Yes.
the speaker.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Deb. Yeah, we're on. Please go ahead.
Hi everyone, welcome to this month's Work Packet 3 of Reintegrate public webinar. I'm your host, Anastasis, and I'm very happy to introduce you to Dave Olley from Aurora Research, a senior associate there, who will be our speaker today, and we'll talk about e-fuels and hydrogen. I've known Dave for quite some time, since our time at the Potsdam Institute, and we've kept in touch, and I am very glad to be able to host a webinar with his input. I leave the rest of the introduction to Dave. So Dave, if you want to tell us a couple of things about you and your work before you begin the actual presentation, feel free to do so, but you don't have to. So yes, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for the great introduction. Yeah, my name's David Olley. Um, I'll apologize in advance. I'm a little bit under the weather today, so if my voice sounds a little bit stuffy, um, that's why. But very much looking forward to presenting some of the work that we've done here. Um, my background is in sort of energy economics and climate policy, although I started actually in physics doing solar cell research, but yeah, since then moved more into the policy and economics space. At Aurora, I focus mainly on low carbon fuels, so that's e-fuels, biofuels, and hydrogen, and then also industrial decarbonization. Um, but today we're talking about e-fuels specifically. We did a large study. Um, we did a large study last year, actually, that we where we looked into e-fuels in Europe, the potentials, and the cost of production and those kinds of things. And then we sort of continued to develop that work over the course of this year, and that's sort of what I'm presenting today is a bit of a snapshot of that. Um, yeah, in our regular work, we do a lot of advising different clients who are often either investors in e-fuels or developers of e-fuel plants or platforms. And yeah, through that we gain some useful insights into the industry. So happy to share some of those now. I'll leave some time for questions at the end. I think I'll try and step through these slides relatively quickly in about half an hour, and then we should have about half an hour for questions at the end. If you have any really burning questions, or there's something that just makes no sense, whatever, please feel free to jump in and just um, you know, unmute yourself and say something, but I'll leave ample time for questions at the end so we can cover them there. I've prepared some slides so I can share those and we can talk through them. Just give me a yell when that is visible.
Sure.
Are we good?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so there's kind of four key themes that we'll touch on today. So the first thing is about the hydrogen and derivatives markets and where they kind of stand currently. Um, and then we look at essentially the demand side and then the supply side. So what's driving the willingness to pay for e-fuels and the demand for e-fuels in Europe? And then what are the average costs of the e-fuels in Europe and how do they compare to imported e-fuels? That's quite a big question. And then we wrap everything up and look at what are the key levers that we need to pull in order to make European e-fuel costs more competitive, and then also enhance the offtaker willingness to pay. As we'll see at the end, excuse me, there is a gap between the cost and the willingness to pay, and we need to bridge that gap somehow in order to get any kind of offtake of e-fuels in Europe. So, okay, where do we stand here? So the first thing to cover is that um, uh, e-fuels have gained importance since the 2022 energy crisis, and of course, I think it was even today or in the last couple of days that the EU has announced that they're fully separating, fully unplugging Russian gas from the European gas grid. So the it's very, you know, the topic of energy independence is becoming more and more important, particularly in Europe and particularly with the current geopolitical climate. So this is one of the sort of motivations for looking more deeply into e-fuels, apart from, of course, decarbonisation, which is probably the main driving force behind it. Speaking of decarbonisation, so what are they sort of used for? E-fuels can bridge decarbonisation gaps. So just maybe taking a step back actually, so we're all on the same page. When I say e-fuels, what I'm talking about are electrofuels. That's what the E stands for, and that is fuels that are produced using electrolytic hydrogen, so hydrogen, green hydrogen, and biogenic carbon dioxide, and then you sort of combine those two to make drop-in fuel replacements, so either kerosene or methanol or gasoline, even these kinds of things. So you can make these hydrocarbons, and then they're a lower carbon alternative to fossil fuels. So we can use these lower carbon alternatives to fossil fuels to decarbonize certain hard to abate sectors, particularly things like maritime transport and aviation, which don't really have any other options for decarbonization over the course of the next 20 to 30 years. And then the third part of this sort of puzzle is that, as we'll see, e-fuels are very expensive to produce. They're very energy intensive. They're very complicated. And that drives the costs up, meaning that the costs are significantly above the costs of the fossil fuel alternatives. And therefore, the demand for these e-fuels is extremely policy dependent. So the EU is playing a very major role in driving any demand for these e-fuels. And like green hydrogen, if it is not for policy, there's basically no demand for it. So policy becomes very, very important. Speaking of policy, here we've mapped out what the main policies are. We've got RED 3, which is the main regulatory framework which covers this. And then there's some more direct e-fuel policy frameworks that are particularly relevant. The ones that I would point out are particularly Refuel EU Aviation, Fuel EU Maritime, and in general, the RED 3 RFNBO targets. So when we say RFNBO, that means renewable fuel of non-biological origin, and e-fuels fall under that. So there's under RED 3, there are targets for decarbonization of sectors that can be done through electrification, it can be done through biofuels, and it can be done through RFNBOs, which includes e-fuels and hydrogen. Refuel EU Aviation and Fuel EU Maritime are very important because they contain specific targets for e-fuels. And then, of course, there are other policy frameworks which are sort of tangentially applicable as well as national policy frameworks and international policy frameworks like the IMO GHG strategy, which unfortunately has been not implemented yet and sort of hangs in the balance currently. When we look at these different policies, we can see that, as I sort of pointed out before, the main relevant ones are RED and the delegated acts, Refuel EU Aviation and Fuel EU Maritime. And the reason for that is basically just because they contain specific e-fuel targets. E-fuel, as I mentioned, e-fuels are incredibly expensive, and without specific targets on them, it's very hard to justify a production of e-fuels or offtake of e-fuels. Good. Looking now towards the demand. So we've assessed the potential market size for these different e-fuels across two axes, which we present on this slide. So on the left-hand side here, we have the potential e-fuel market size by end use. So gas networks, existing industry, maritime and aviation are the sort of main ones that we're looking at here. Existing industry contains things like chemical industry and refineries, those kinds of things. And then on the right-hand side, we've got the potential supply mix. So that's of those industries, what they can be supplied with. So we've focused on four kind of key e-fuels here, which is e-ammonia, e-kerosene, e-methanol, and e-methane. E-ammonia and e-methanol are both used in the chemical industry, but can also be used as a shipping fuel. So that's an important part. E-methane is used mainly in sort of gas grids and, it's a natural gas alternative. And then e-kerosene is, that's used for aviation fuel, or it is aviation fuel. And it's essentially the only way that we can decarbonize the aviation industry in the coming decades. Turning now to the costs of e-fuels. We looked at a couple of different cost scenarios. When you look at e-fuels, there are kind of three main feedstocks that you have to consider. So as I mentioned, you need green hydrogen. You need what's called biogenic CO2, which is carbon dioxide that is in principle being removed from the atmosphere in the recent past. And then you also need power. The cost of electrolytic hydrogen or of green hydrogen is largely a power cost, and we'll get to the sort of breakdown in a minute, actually. But what I want to show with this slide here is that you've got a couple of different ways of setting up your plant as well. So we've looked at a high cost scenario, a base scenario, and a low cost scenario. The lowest cost scenario, perhaps most importantly, is the one where you have all of your different feedstocks co-located and put sort of in the same place. So you don't have to deal then with transportation of your carbon dioxide source, your transportation of your hydrogen so much because they're all co-located. And then also if you have on-site renewables, that really eases the procurement of green electricity on top of having less issues with grid connections as well. So these plants use an extremely large amount of electricity, of power, and European electricity grids are currently sort of extremely strained, and anything that you can do to reduce your reliance on the grid or to reduce your impact on the grid is also very, very, very important. So we looked at, again, we looked at these four different e-fuels: ammonia, kerosene, methanol, and methane. And we looked at them in three kind of countries in detail, three European countries in detail. So that's Germany, Spain, and Sweden. And then also we've got Brazil here as a sort of export from Brazil, import to Europe market or cost comparison. Then, of course, we also have the fossil fuel as a point of comparison too. That's made up of three components. We have the actual cost, which is base cost of the fossil fuel, the CO2 cost associated with that, and then also the penalty. So what do we mean by penalty? A penalty here is the penalty that would be imposed by Refuel EU Aviation in the case of e-kerosene, and then Fuel EU Maritime in the case of e-ammonia and e-methanol. So we can see here that the penalty for Refuel EU Aviation is very, very, very high, and that's kind of the only way that's where motivating uptake of e-fuels in Europe is by having very, very, very high penalties. What we can see from here is that Germany is a relatively high cost country to produce e-fuels in. Sweden is a relatively low cost country to produce e-fuels in, although still higher than Brazil. The reason for that is that Sweden has ample access to green electricity. The main cost component of e-fuels is the electricity cost. And in Sweden, there is a large amount of cheap green electricity. That's essentially what it comes down to. In Brazil, that's kind of also the case, but on top of that, they also have cheaper carbon dioxide and more ready access to biogenic carbon dioxide as well, due to the large amount of agricultural activity happening there. But as we can see from this, the costs of producing these fuels, and this is for 2030, by the way, as well. The cost of producing these fuels are still many times what the base fossil price is. So this is why we need policy to help bridge that gap. Looking here at a bit of a breakdown. So we broke down these costs into terms of CapEx, OpEx, power, hydrogen, CO2, and then that makes up the total e-fuel cost. Hydrogen here is put as a separate line item, but of course, if you have a co-located electrolyzer, which is sort of the cheapest way of doing it, then your hydrogen cost is actually just your power cost as well. So it really comes down to how cheaply you can procure green electricity. If you can lower your green electricity costs, then you can lower your cost of producing e-fuels. That's the main takeaway from this. So how do we wrap this up all together? So we sort of bring this into two factors here. There's push factors and there's pull factors. Push factors are ones that are going to bring up the willingness to pay to a higher level. And pull factors are ones that are going to bring the cost of e-fuels down. So the push factors can be penalties, subsidies, or a sort of green premium. Penalties we've spoken about. That's kind of what's done now in the areas where there is activity for e-fuel offtake. There are these, in some cases, very large penalties. Subsidies could also be an option here, but we don't really see many subsidies at all. I think there might be some subsidies that get developed in the coming 5 years, but it really depends how much money European governments are willing to put into this area. And thus far, there's been less investment than there would need to be. Let's put it that way. There's also a green premium that some corporations are willing to pay. So there are definitely some cases that we've seen in the market where people are off-taking e-fuels, even though they sort of don't need to, if you will. And so that green premium exists there as well. Those are all things that drive up the willingness to pay for e-fuels. Then there are these pull factors that drive down the cost as well. There are three main things here. There's CapEx, there's grid fee exemption. So I spoke about the importance of the grid fees as well. And then there's also any kind of subsidies to reduce the cost of the feedstocks, so particularly green hydrogen or biogenic CO2. Excuse me. Yeah, so to round up on this, actually I'm even a little bit ahead of time, but that's good. That leaves us more time for questions. Demand is driven by policies with a specific e-fuel target. So if you don't have a specific e-fuel target, then actually it's cheaper. So for like in the case of road transport, we see much more electrification used to achieve RED 3 targets as opposed to e-fuels, although people keep on talking about using e-fuels to decarbonize road transport, but it's not the most efficient way to go about that. Um, these policies create incentives for e-fuel offtake, because which is required because there's no otherwise the opportunity cost for fuel switching is a bit too high, really. Imports are extremely competitive, but Nordic countries can be competitive in this. In terms of the sort of European market or European production market, there are of course many other places in the world that can produce e-fuels a lot cheaper than Europe, but that's what we looked at there. And then in order to close this gap, so if we are going to decarbonize these hard to abate industries through the use of e-fuels, then we need to work both on the supply side and the demand side, putting upward pressure on the willingness to pay and downward pressure on the levelized cost of e-fuels. So that could mean subsidies for offtake, subsidies for feedstocks, and then also reduction of group fees, these kinds of things. Yeah, so that's the main content. I'll leave it here because I think this is probably a good slide to sit on, but I would open the floor to any questions.
Thanks so much, Dave. Really nice overview, very informative. And thanks also so much for presenting while also struggling a bit with a cold there. I open the floor for questions for both the chat and the audience. There's already one question in the chat, and then I will follow up with a few myself. So Herbie is asking, since it's new to them, what is the basic practice of, SL? What would that mean? Share with me more on storage and hazard level if applied. So I guess it's a twofold question on any information you have on storage and hazard level, and then what is the basic practice of SL?
What does SL mean?
Yeah, I wonder. Maybe Herbie can help us here, but while you respond on the storage and hazard level.
Yeah. In Sri Lanka. Yeah, to be honest, I haven't looked at Sri Lanka at all. So I don't really have any information there. In terms of hazard level and storage, so these fuels are already shipped and stored. Of course, there is a hazard level associated with some of these e-fuels, particularly ammonia. I'm sure we will all remember it wasn't too long ago that we've had quite some issues with the storage of ammonia. And methanol is also not a particularly pleasant chemical to be storing or dealing with. But the point is that they are currently stored and shipped across the world. So there are safety procedures in place there. None of these are the innovative thing here, or the new part of it is not the actual end products. They're all readily existing. The new part is how we produce them. Right, I see it.
Yeah. Sure, Bryce, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Thanks, David. I've also got a background in physics and in energy and climate policy, I guess now.
Nice.
Thanks for the presentation. Yeah, I'm with the South African team on Reintegrate. And I focus a lot more on the industrial side of things from our analysis. I just want to find out what are the uses in industry for these? Are these chemical feedstocks, or are these
Generally,
energy, not energy specifically, hey? Is that right?
generally not. So, I mean, Um, the real use of e-fuels comes in places where you can't decarbonize through direct electrification. If you can decarbonize the sector through direct electrification, then it is almost always the better way to handle that.
Yeah, we generally find ourselves that the electrification is usually more cost competitive compared to the hydrogen route. But I mean thanks.
Absolutely.
That's kind of the follow-up query was what are the challenges in Europe on the electrification part of and why you're looking at the e-fuels part.
Yeah, so the e-fuels and the hydrogen RFNBO question in general is really it comes down to how do you deal with the parts that you can't deal with through direct electrification. So for example, in refineries, so for hydrogen, of course, in refineries, there's already an existing hydrogen offtake. That hydrogen is currently produced through from syngas, so from fossil syngas, um, uh, and you can replace that with green hydrogen. So that's sort of one saving, and you kind of have to do it that way. You can't electrify that part. When it comes to other things like the aviation sector, so uh, I was at a panel a little while ago now, earlier this year, where there was a representative from Airbus, and they haven't decided they're developing hydrogen planes, but they haven't decided uh, what the method of powering those planes is yet, whether it's direct combustion of hydrogen, whether it's fuel cells. So I'm not an aviation expert, but it takes like decades to develop an airframe, right? And it's going to be even longer if you haven't even decided how you're going to power that airplane, that airframe. So for those kinds of sectors, e-fuels is really the only option. If we're looking at decarbonizing aviation by 2050, then there's kind of no alternative apart from just not having an aviation industry, which is, we can also discuss what the implications of that would be or how realistic that scenario is. But at the end of the day, that's the choice that we face. Yeah. So I mean, to wrap up, yeah. So I think for hydrogen and e-fuels, so hydrogen and derivatives, I would say they'll lose almost every time to electrification. But there are some applications where electrification is not an option, and that's where we have to look at these things. Muna.
Yeah, Mona from Tunisia. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. It's very informative, and I think I got interested in the pull factors. So I know this is quite theoretical for future predictions, but I wonder how, in practice, how are these costs covered? The grid fee exemptions, the feedstock offtake subsidies. Who compensates these values?
At the end of the day, it would have to be national governments that were compensating them through, and the money would have to come through money that they've put aside for adhering to RED III. So there's RED III, which is the EU level policy, and then each country has to ratify that, and they get a choice about how they do that. And if Germany, for example, is going to decarbonize the aviation sector, for example, then they need to implement a policy that is going to motivate the uptake of e-fuels in that policy, of e-fuels in that country. So ultimately, the money would just come from a direct government subsidy. The exact method will be different between different countries and how they structure those policies. But yeah, that's where it has to. That's where it comes from in the end of the day. The sort of, excuse me, the fundamental issue that we face is that it's extremely energy intensive to produce these fuels. You need a lot of electricity, and no matter how, you know, for the foreseeable future, it's going to be very expensive to produce them, except in certain situations. So like you can get some costs that decrease significantly if you look at in the Nordics specifically. In Brazil you can get lower costs. So the costs can come down toward parity with fossil fuels, but there's always going to be this tension between them.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. There's another question in the chat.
Yes, they're illustrating an issue with essentially curtailment on the electricity produced by wind in Sri Lanka, and a potential solution being using this power for the production of e-fuels, if I understand correctly. And what is your take on that?
Yeah. So that's a really interesting question, and a lot of people are looking at that. The issue that you run into, so electrolyzers are a huge source of electricity. They draw a lot of electricity. They're a very large power drain, and then of course they can be used to help balance the grid and help lower the amount of curtailment within an energy system. So curtailment, of course, being when power producers are switched off in order to maintain the grid level, which is sort of wasted electricity. So you can use that wasted electricity. The issue there is that ramping electrolyzers is quite difficult, depending on the type of electrolyzer. So some of them can't really ramp very quickly at all. And by ramping, I mean increasing, or the rate at which they can increase or decrease their power draw. So some kinds of electrolyzers can't really ramp very quickly at all, which is something you would need. Some kinds of electrolyzers can ramp very quickly, but the other thing to consider there is it degrades the electrolyzer. So your electrolyzer, it's kind of like if you're driving your car, right? If you're always driving your car by putting your foot on the gas to the max and then slamming your foot on the brakes every time you want to stop, then your car is going to be visiting the mechanic a lot more frequently. Same thing with the electrolyzers. If you talk to anyone who's actually running an electrolyzer, they really don't like this idea of ramping up and down the electrolyzer all the time. They want to have a nice stable output. On top of that, the other issue is that if you're running an electrolyzer, you're selling a product, right? You're selling e-fuels, you're selling hydrogen, and you want to be running that actually most of the time. If you're only using this waste electricity, you're going to be running for 50 to 100 hours of the year, right? But actually, really, what we see when people actually run these electrolyzers and these e-fuel plants is they're running upwards of 7,000 hours per year. So there's 8,760 hours in a year. You're running above 7,000 hours a year. So if you're doing that, then of course you can use some of this sort of wasted electricity, but it's not your main power source. And it's again, you have to take into account the how quickly you can ramp your electrolyzer, and if you're willing to deal with the negative impacts of that.
Very good. Very good. Follow-up question real quick. What are the timescales we are talking about here? Or actually, yes, to have a sustainable use of the electrolyzers, what would be the appropriate ramping up and ramping down time? Do you have any estimate?
So so there's two main types of electrolyzer technology. There's PEM electrolyzers and then alkaline electrolyzers. PEM electrolyzers are a lot more flexible. They can ramp, I think, within minutes even. The alkaline electrolyzers are much less flexible, and that's sort of more on the range of hours, I would say. But I'm not as much of an expert on those particular properties, I have to admit.
Interesting, very interesting. Yes, there's another question in the chat. If in your model, if you're predicting the unit cost of e-fuel in the future, or if you have used any model to predict the unit cost of e-fuel in the future.
So these costs that I present here are in 2030. So this is in 5 years from now, and then this is what we're looking at here. That takes into account so we as Aurora we produce long-term power price forecasts. That's kind of our main business, and then that's kind of the main cost component of e-fuels, and then we use that in order to calculate what the average, so the levelized cost, the average cost of the e-fuels in these particular countries would be here. What is the efficiency of e-fuel comparing to solar and wind energy? So the round trip efficiency of generating e-fuels. So of course you use solar and wind energy to produce the e-fuels, and then depending on what you're doing with them, it depends exactly on what you're doing with them. But to give you a sort of ballpark figure, it's very low. It's like 20-something%. So in mid, like 23 to 25%, something like that. That's the sort of efficiency of e-fuels. And this gets back to Bryce's question about comparison with electrification. So this is why if you can do direct electrification, so using directly the electricity from the wind and solar, then that's what you should do. If you can't, that's when you need to look at these other fuels.
I may have a couple of questions myself, since there are also no other hands raised from the audience. Yes, I was positively surprised to see no use in road transport. And so the question is that a modeling assumption by you guys, or is it something that comes out of the cost-benefit analysis, so that it becomes negligible and it's not even shown in the graph?
Well, sort of both. I mean, we looked at the costs of it and just said, yeah, okay, this is not going to happen, and then sort of baked it into our assumptions. We do have to caveat that a little bit. There's here in Germany, there's a push to integrate the use of e-fuels more in terms of road transport. But fundamentally, because of the efficiency questions, it still doesn't really make sense. The places where it can make sense are for like heavy goods vehicles,
Exactly.
and long distance transport there. But in our modeling, we also don't see that really coming in until a little bit sort of in the early 2040s, and then not in any real significant amount until the 2050s.
But then there's the issue of if it only comes in later and you, in the meantime, stop producing internal combustion engines, then you would have to start producing them again. And I see lots of issues there with maintaining a market and then putting it aside and then ramping it up again. Yeah.
I fully agree. I mean, I also don't see a world where we stop, where we have the 2035 ICE ban and then we start it up again with e-fuels. But I think that there will, that at least in Germany where I'm based, there's a lot of calls for to make sure that there's exemptions there for trucking companies and players like this to continue operating. The legislation by which Germany ratifies RED III, which they call the GHG quota, or the greenhouse gas quota, is currently a topic of very heated debate within the German parliament. So an update to this was proposed in the summer by the environmental ministry, and then that's getting a lot of pushback now from the economic ministry, and it's really we'll know more next year, but at the moment it's very uncertain what the future of that looks like. So initially they were going to be including maritime and aviation within that policy. Now it looks like they're not going to, it sort of remains to be seen.
Interesting. There's another question in the chat.
For the comparison with biofuels beyond the obvious point, so biofuels are generally cheaper. The issue with biofuels comes down to availability. That's the if you have biofuels that are directly available, then that comes down that's a lot easier to go down that route. For Fuel EU Maritime and Refuel EU Aviation, they have specific specific e-fuel targets. So part of those policies can be fulfilled with biofuels. Part of those specifically have to be filled with not biofuels, i.e., renewable fuels of non-biological origin. There's definitely space for biofuels there, and a lot of people, like particularly for sustainable aviation fuels, biofuels is a huge part. And at the moment in Germany, most of this GHG quota that Germany has, so GHG reduction quota, is fulfilled by biofuels. It's like over half is fulfilled by biofuels. So that's kind of the sort of status quo. But you run into the issue of availability, and feedstock availability in particular is what I mean there. And then if you look at the sort of total demand that we're going to be facing from the chemical industry, from shipping, from aviation, then you can't do it only with biofuels.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The two are sort of intimately related as well. We had, hydrogen in general has gone through this hype cycle in recent years, and we're in a sort of reality check period now. And then we are now sort of moving in that reality check movement period, we've seen a lot more interest in biofuels. It's funny, sort of, we had the early 2000s, there was a lot of stuff happening in biofuels, and then sort of the pendulum has swung to hydrogen. Now it's sort of swinging back to biofuels. We'll see it swing back to hydrogen at some point as well, I'm sure. And we'll find some kind of happy medium, but I think it has to be a both thing.
Yes. Yeah, very interesting. Maybe as a final question, aiming at getting one more takeaway from all this. So a positive surprise was to see that the bottleneck in costs is actually electricity and the transportation costs, if I understood correctly. So from technology improvements and improvements in the way e-fuels are produced, we are not expecting to see much cost reductions in total, you think?
It comes down to electrolyzer cost reduction. So if we can make more efficient electrolyzers cheaper, then you can reduce the cost of e-fuels. Once you get the hydrogen, then the production of the actual e-fuel is done by pretty well-known processes. So like Fischer-Tropsch, for example, for the production of e-kerosene, this is a chemical process that has been done for the last, 50 years or something like that, longer. So there's not so much learning that can be done there. But in terms of the electrolyzers, we do see, or we do anticipate a cost reduction in electrolyzers in the coming decades. It's probably not going to be the same story with solar, where it's just kind of fallen through the floor, but there will be efficiency improvements and cost reductions there, and then that will reduce this this green bar here, the hydrogen part, which, as you can see, is the lion's share of the costs.
And it will also save hydrogen, it seems. The ability to use it for other purposes than as an energy source, rather using it as a feedstock for e-fuels is something that could save it for its industry, which is now shaking a bit after all the hype has passed.
Yeah, and I mean, in general, what we're seeing is that in the industrial, in Europe, there's just lagging demand, and it's because at the end of the day, the demand is generated by policy, and European countries are kind of dragging their feet in terms of actually putting that policy into practice. So it was this year that they were supposed to actually implement RED III policies. So the EU countries are supposed to implement RED III policies, and essentially that kind of hasn't happened. That's one of the main reasons that we're seeing lagging demand. Different countries are at different stages of implementing that policy. It's sort of happening, but slower than one would like.
There's another question in the chat. We still have some time.
More information on the conversation of e-fuel, methodology of transforming. I'm not sure I understand the question.
First of all, I think they asked for your slides and main key persons in the industry and research, I guess. And I think that it's about the technologies for transforming hydrogen to e-fuels. I think the ones you just mentioned.
Yeah,
if I'm not mistaken.
Sure. So I mean the methodology for transforming hydrogen to e-fuels, it's Fischer-Tropsch for e-kerosene. It's the Haber-Bosch process for producing ammonia, which is of course a very well-known transformation process. And for the other two, I think it's steam gas reforming for methane. I would have to check, but happy to. If you, Herbie, if you want to get in contact with the organizers, they can share my contact details, and I'm happy to take that one offline if you want more information.
That's very nice of you. Thank you, Dave. Good. Seems there are no more questions, and I think we had a very good discussion, and given the fact that you are a bit ill, I can say we can close the webinar here. It was to me very informative and seemed a big success and a great help for the audience. Thanks, David, once more, and have a good day, everyone.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to speak, and yeah, thanks very much.
Anytime.
See you soon.